Okay, less is more. So I've got something to say about it, but I think you've got some interesting things to say about it too.
Yeah. You want to kick it off?
Yeah, I'll kick it off. So there's multiple ways to look at the less is more philosophy, and one of the things I learned from Doug Sachs, my mentor, early on when I started learning this process, was how to use as little as possible to get the signal from point A to point B. So that's really, if you want to start from the back and work towards the front, and really have a consciousness about what you're doing step by step to end up with some audio that you're giving to the client that is then serving their fans with that audio. So you need a song with no veil in between. You need a song that the listener really connects to. Less is more is ultimately the philosophy you want to go with, because you don't want it to sound like you've forced anything to get there. And there's a couple of ways to see that in terms of how many pieces of gear you use in your chain. So one of the things I do is early on when I learned how to modify equipment, we would take a lot of op amps and unnecessary processing out of each piece of gear to clean up the signal. A lot of people do it. In our case, we would terminate at 600 ohms so that we didn't have to use op amps to drive longer cable lengths, and therefore if we pulled all that stuff out of the gear, we could use more pieces of gear, longer cable, without any type of degradation, that type of thing. And once I figured that out, what I liked to do was to use a little bit of processing of really great pieces of gear, so that you would have something that would add up to a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts, and have some depth of field and size, and really listening to the music, listening to the audio, and seeing if we can come up with some depth of field and stuff like that. And I think when you look at a chain of events, you might see a lot of pieces of gear, but you're using a little bit of each, and the way the gear is modified really promotes the less is more philosophy. So that's one of the ways to look at it that I enjoy, and I appreciate getting from point A to point B this way. I think ultimately you don't want to add tools into the equation if you don't need them. For instance, if you're building a house, you'll visualize the house, and then you'll look at your tool bag, and you'll figure out which tools you want to bring out to accomplish that mission. Once you have a sense of what that house is going to be, instead of just pulling out all the tools and then getting confused by everything. So this is a process we go through too. We pull out as little as we can, but if you find that you want two equalizers, for instance, a tube equalizer combined with the solid state equalizer, so that you can get a little punch from the solid state EQ and a little saturation from the tube EQ, and combine those elements together, you're going to get some saturation and some punch, and like that. When you build your chain like that, you're not adding more equalization just for the sake of it to have more. You're really carefully thinking it out. So even though you've got more in there than less, so to speak, two equalizers instead of one, it's still less is more. So that's one aspect of the less is more philosophy. You have anything you want to talk about?
I think now in today's age we have everybody has all the tools at their disposal, and you can very quickly end up in a scenario where you end up putting all these things on your mix, and it's actually creating a situation where you have diminishing returns, because the tools, just putting them on the mix creates a departure from experiencing the mix in its fullest potential. So understanding less is more means just putting on just what you need, and then knowing when to walk away and when to just leave it be. And it's very easy to get seduced by all these different tools and want to put everything on anything. But if you take that approach, you can quickly lose the understanding of what is really needed. What does this particular mix need, which is unlike any other mix that exists in the world? What is the perfect cocktail of processing that's going to realize this in its best form? And it's definitely not always the same cocktail. It's really understanding where that mix is and what it really wants. Where does it want to end up? And you kind of let it tell you where to go. That's the real beauty of it. So understanding how little to put on something and when to walk away is a big part of how to get the best job done. But it doesn't mean to do just a little amount of processing just for the sake of doing a little amount of processing either. It's understanding what you need to achieve and how to get it there. So sometimes we'll do two different processes that might work against one another. In other words, you might brighten some EQ something brighter into something on top, like a high frequency limiter that works in juxtaposition to that. So you're opening something up as you're darkening it at the same time, and those two processes create this nice big bloom, so it feels open but not pointed or edgy on top. You might, if you get too careful and think, hey, I gotta not do too much, you might miss that opportunity to really explore that. So it's the less is more philosophy in terms of not adding things on just for the sake of adding things on and taking a departure from where you end up wanting to be, but also understanding that there is certain cases where you might want to get in there and get your hands dirty and actually work something, and that's what it needs to really get to where it needs to be.
What's interesting about that is less is more doesn't mean less things to get more results. For instance, we're an all analog facility, all analog console, but I constantly keep up with the plugins out there, and there are applications in which we use them. But even without that, I'm still doing work to keep up on what's going on in the box world. So, for instance, if I have a chain on my analog console and I just want to try to replicate that chain, what I'll do is I'll set up similar plugins to what the hardware is. But for instance, on a 2BQ, let's say something like the EAR, Tim DeParavicini EQ that we use fairly frequently in the front of our chain. So if I find something else that loosely replicates that, I might need to add a saturator in front or on the other side, in the back of that, just to combine that to create one element. So in building those two plugins together and integrating them together, I'm replicating one piece of gear in my analog chain with saturation, because when you're digital, you don't have that same saturation that happens in the amplification process and recovery amps and all types of stuff in the analog chain. You have to kind of put a little extra something in the digital chain to replicate that. So if I combine these two elements together to then combine them with the rest of a chain, yeah, you could look at that and say, look, there's extra things here, take some off to fit into the less is more. But in fact, what I'm doing is I'm replicating something and I'm keeping my eye on the prize. And I think that's the key behind what Reuben was saying and what I was saying earlier, is to have a vision of that point B in space. Point A, point B. Point A is the mix. Point B is where you're going to take it and make your deliverables. So if you have an idea of what that's going to be, even a loose idea at the front of your work, as that gets honed in as you're doing the work, knowing that point B is going to be depth of field, it's going to be size, blooming of the mix, and so forth, you'll figure out how to get there by combining these elements and using your best experience to create something that is greater than the sum of its parts. So the less is more really amounts to something that blooms into something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that's really the key between the less is more philosophy and the more is more philosophy.
Right. And it's very important, as Gavin was saying, to keep your eye on the prize. Where do you want to end up? And there's many paths to that place. And part of exploring the mastering process is understanding all the different paths you can go down and really understanding those paths, because every process in a series of process influences every other process as one giant global process. So if I decide to use this compressor instead of another compressor, it's going to be integrating with all of the other processes. Maybe an EQ will feed into one compressor in a sweeter, more appealing way than a different set of processes. And sometimes when you're exploring the right path, you have to try one, print it, then try a whole different other path, and then print that and A/B between the two. And what do you go off? Well, how do you know which one's right? Which one do you just want to keep on and not switch away from? Which one keeps your attention, keeps you connected to the music? That's the one to zone in on. And then that process, study it, because it could work another fashion somewhere else, a year later or a few days later with another project, And another important thing is that if a particular cocktail or a particular formula ends up working on one song, it could be something that you might want to consider for the other songs on a project, because there's continuity with processing. And part of using the same processing across the board in terms of your starting point, of course, each song is going to need its own fine-tuning, but the processing in and of itself adds a certain color and texture that is a way to also achieve continuity, not just correcting each song in terms of its EQ, compression amounts, dynamic range, and overall level, so you end up kind of bringing everything to a certain point, but the character and the color of the processes just themselves will add a certain hue and color and texture and unique flavor that will be its own unique flavor for a bunch of songs or a compilation or an album. That's important too.
Great.
Yeah. That's the philosophy, is adding things together to create something useful.
Now, you guys are known for your world-class analog mastering. It definitely has a certain sound that is very appealing, and it's kind of like a dark magic what you guys do. Do you think that it's the way you process audio, or is the gear itself that you have that makes that sound? And how is that related with the less is more philosophy?
So, in the act of mastering, when you're in there doing it, when you're actually twisting the knobs or clicking the mouse and you're playing with the music until it feels right to you, that process in and of itself informs your decisions along the way. So as you're working, so much is found every step of the way, and more information is revealed, and the song really tells you where it wants to end up. And you kind of, as you get used to doing this day in, day out, it's kind of like it guides your decisions in terms of where it wants to be. You follow that, and then it starts coming to life in a way that you understand where to move forward towards that place and what it feels like to move away from that place. And that is a big part of the process. So when we end up deciding what types of processes to put on, that's experience talking. That's experience talking to us in our own inner dialogue in terms of this particular mix, based off its dynamic content, based off how it's currently sitting, and where we end up wanting to take it has everything to do with what we introduce. But that doesn't mean we just try it and then we stop there. We have to try it and see. And occasionally we'll find that a particular mix or batch of mixes can be in more than one place, or at least have more than one road to its finished end result. So a lot of times we'll try it both ways. We'll print it with some tube saturation on the analog console, feeding into maybe some tube compression, into some solid state compression, into some high frequency limiting, into some digital limiting post conversion. We'll take that path, and then we'll try the exact same thing, but we'll just remove the tube EQ, right? But then because of that, doesn't mean that we just have everything else the same without that tube EQ. We have to feather everything else around the fact that tube EQ is no longer there to find a preferred balance in the end. And then what do? We A-B the two, but we also, before even A-Bing the two, as we're printing, we're feeling it. We're feeling, do I feel that this is fully realized? Do I feel that special feeling that just gives me that green light in my head, feeling like this is really great? Because once you have that, and you feel really good about it, the beauty of that is that most people will also have that shared experience. And that's what's really beautiful about this process of making music and mastering music, mixing and mastering, is that these experiences are shared. So much of this process is an exploratory process. Every day is different. Every mix is its own signature thing, and finding where that mix wants to be is part of the fun and part of the journey every day.
Yeah, my version of that is similar, but what I do is I see shapes and sizes. So when I listen to audio, somehow shapes and sizes come into my field of imaginary vision. So when I start to listen to a mix, and I start to visualize where I'm going to take that mix, I'm really just kind of straightening that shape out. And when it gets to that final shape that I see in the beginning, I kind of feel like I'm done. It's a strange sort of esoteric process, but on our analog console, as Reuben was explaining, it allows us to really fine-tune and shape each part of the song, the verse, the chorus. We frequently, I would say probably on every song, ride the verse and the chorus differently, and we've got these analog pots, these knobs that are not sliders but rotary pots from old school vintage analog technology, and we'll sit there and adjust dBs for verses versus choruses, and maybe adjust the EQ and open up the chorus and that kind of thing. So all of this allows us to bring that final shape together, So that's just my process. Everybody's got their own process, whether you're working in the box or on the analog console. People talk about the dark art, and I think that's what it is. In my case, it's just seeing that shape and having an understanding of how I'm going to get from point A to point B with that music. And I'm always thinking about depth of field, about transparency, about size, and about everything I can deliver to the client that's going to allow them to serve their fans in the best way, so that there's no veil in that recording. The listener can connect directly with that artist, and it swells and it grows and it blooms and it's sizable and it's got everything that it needs without sounding like you were ever there to do it.
Yeah, and we're, like Gavin was saying, we're riding verse to chorus, chorus to verse, then to chorus, then to bridge. Every song has its own journey and has a life, so we follow those rides that's already there in the mix, but through our processing, we're blooming, we're embellishing, we're bringing detail out, we're really bringing the mix to really reach you, and so it's going to translate across any environment it's played back on. So as we're doing it, it's not, some people are under the impression that it's a one setting and then you just kind of set and forget and then on to the next song, but that's not how it is for us at all. We're listening to how those transitions are taking place, and we're making sure that those feel as musical as possible. So sometimes that means, building up to a chorus by riding those attenuators open, right? So they release and create a chorus to really bloom. And then maybe we're riding EQ to compensate for that level difference, right? And then coming out of that chorus into the next verse, we might be backing it off, not in a way that you're so conscious of, because you don't want to be conscious of it feeling like it's folding, it's coming back. But it's more that it's just kind of relaxing in a very natural way, so that then you can then come back for the second chorus, and that second chorus comes with impact, right? And you might want to ride it differently, depending on the arrangement. Maybe it's a little bit of a drum fill, and then on the down, you're riding up that drum fill, and then right on the down, you snap right on just before the down, so it comes in. Or if it's like a big, drop, like a EDM drop, we might be just, hitting it both left and right at the same time, bam, versus, if we kind of wanted to swell into it, we might do left independent of right, and then coming out of it, we might go right and then down on left, so it tricks the ear, so you're not so conscious of that ride, and that's a Doug Sachs technique that was passed to Gavin and then passed to me. So there's some lineage there too.
Yeah, and Arnie Acosta was famous for doing that. So Arnie Acosta is a great engineer that I enjoyed having a relationship with in my time over at the lab with Doug Sachs. You do one side and then the other. Dave Pensado talks about that a little bit too, about this sort of sawtooth thing where you adjust the level up and down into gear, because you're not hearing the straight cut, because you're saturating as well. You're sending that level into compressors. So by the time it kind of smooths off those sawtooth edges, you're just getting this kind of swell and dynamic and that sort of thing,
And part of what keys you into how to make those rides is based off the compression that's happening in the chain, the natural compression that's happening by going through this dynamic process, So as those compressors are working and they're feeling like they're filling up, if you will, in a way, it's like almost like filling up a balloon. They're kind of you're feeding signal into them and they're blooming, right? And as you back off from them, it's almost like that balloon just relaxes a little bit. So then you can kind of, like I said, come back into it, and then it takes its full shape again. So if you had less compression, you might ride a little differently, because you're not working up against so much of a, something that fills up,
But keep in mind what he's talking about. That natural compression is on an analog console. When you work with plugins, it's a different story, because there's a simulations of analog circuitry. So even under the best of circumstances and 100 years from now, or 1,000, it's going to be a simulation of analog circuit saturation. And so when the natural compression happens, pushing music into an analog console with pieces of gear in series that have been modified or not, you're still going to get some compression from that alone. So when I was talking about adding a plugin to another plugin to create one plugin earlier, when I was talking about how to put a saturator maybe on something that looks like a tube EQ plugin to mimic one tube equalizer that's in our console, that's what I'm talking about, is really understanding that swell, that depth of field, that size, how to create that with minimal gear, and manipulating digital plugins is an art unto itself that you can really bring something to the table with if you have a background in analog signal processing.